Welcome to Wild Lore Bedtime Stories. Tonight you'll hear The Silence She Inherited. This is the story of the thriller, a voice that speaks from the scar, not the wound. A truth that cuts through what others won't name. If this is your archetype, this is the sharpness you carry, not as a weapon, but as a way through. The gallery was closed, but she had a key. She moved through the dark room slowly, her cane tapping a rhythm against the polished floor. The paintings watched from their walls, abstract shapes in reds and blacks, edges that didn't resolve. Figures caught mid-gesture. Her work. Her whole career hung in these rooms. And tonight, for the first time in months, she couldn't stand to look at any of it. The cane caught on a threshold and she stumbled, catching herself against a doorframe. Pain flared in her hip, the old pain, the permanent one, the reminder she carried with every step. She breathed through it the way she'd learned to breathe through most things, steady, deliberate, refusing to let it win. 3 years since the accident, 3 years since the car that ran the light, the months in the hospital, the surgeries that fixed what could be fixed and left the rest. 3 years of learning to walk again, to paint again, to live in a body that no longer moved the way she remembered. The cane had been her aunt's idea. "Stop fighting it," her aunt had said, pressing the carved wooden handle into her palm. "The cane isn't defeat. It's just truth. Your body needs help now. Let it have help." Her aunt had known about bodies that needed help, had known about pain that didn't end, about scars that couldn't be hidden, had known most of all about the silence that grew around things no one wanted to name. She reached the center of the gallery where her largest painting hung. It was the piece that had made her famous, a canvas 6 feet tall, covered in slashes of red and black, a figure barely visible at the center, mouth open in something between a scream and a song. Critics called it visceral, unflinching, brutally honest. They didn't know the half of it. She stood before the painting and felt the familiar knot in her chest. The piece was about her aunt. About what had happened to her aunt years ago in a house where silence was the rule and survival meant never speaking. She had painted it without permission, without warning, had poured her aunt's unspoken story onto canvas and hung it for the world to see. Her aunt had seen the painting once, had stood in this exact spot, leaning on a cane of her own, and looked at her story rendered in reds and blacks. "You told it," her aunt had said, not angry, not grateful, just stating a fact the way she stated all facts. Truth doesn't wait for comfort. I'm glad someone finally said it out loud. Those words had become her compass. Every time she picked up a brush, every time she opened her mouth to speak what others wanted left silent. She.co. Your stories. Truth doesn't wait for comfort. But tonight, standing alone in the dark gallery, she wondered if she'd gotten it wrong. If telling truths had become a way of avoiding the one truth she couldn't face. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her editor asking about the memoir she'd promised. The memoir she hadn't written. The story she'd been circling for 3 years, never landing. She turned away from the painting and walked toward the exit, her cane tapping its steady rhythm against the floor. Some silences were other people's to break, but some silences were her own. It was time to find out which was which. Act 1. The Call to Speak. She had been circling the memoir for 3 years. It should have been easy. She'd built her whole career on telling hard truths, on canvas, in interviews, in the essays she published that made people uncomfortable and made her necessary. She had spoken about violence and survival, about bodies that broke and healed crooked, about the things families buried and the cost of excavation. But all of that had been about other people's stories, other people's silences. The memoir was supposed to be about her, about the accident, the recovery, the person she'd become on the other side, Her editor called it an unflinching account of trauma and transformation. The advance had been generous. The deadline had passed twice. Every time she sat down to write, the words scattered like roaches in light. She knew why. She just didn't want to admit it. The phone rang. Her aunt's number. "You're avoiding something," her aunt said without preamble. No hello, no small talk. That wasn't their way. "I'm working." "You're circling. I can hear it in your voice." 3 years of circling. A pause. The accident wasn't the whole story, was it? She didn't answer. Her aunt didn't need her to. "There's something underneath," her aunt continued. "Something older. The accident broke the surface, but the thing underneath? That's what you're running from." Her grip tightened on the phone. Her aunt had always seen too much, had always named the things others danced around. It was a gift she'd inherited, and sometimes it felt like a curse. "You taught me that truth doesn't wait for comfort," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "I did, and you've been very good at telling everyone else's truth." Her aunt's voice softened, just slightly. "But the hardest truth is always the one with your own name on it. You know that." She did know. She'd known for 3 years, circling and circling, telling every story except the one that mattered. "What if I can't?" she whispered. "Then you'll keep circling, and circling is just a slower kind of silence." Her aunt paused. "I didn't teach you to be silent, Mija. I taught you to cut through." After they hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand and felt the old fear rising. Not fear of pain. She knew pain and lived with it daily. Not fear of judgment. She'd been judged before and survived. Fear of the thing underneath. The truth she'd buried so deep, she'd almost convinced herself it wasn't there. Almost. She picked up her pencil and turned to a blank page. The words didn't come, but for the first time in months, she didn't run. Act 2. The ascent through exposure. The words came slowly like blood from a wound that had scabbed over. She wrote in fragments at first, images, sensations, memories that surfaced and submerged before she could catch them. But gradually, a shape began to form. Not the story she'd planned to tell. Not the neat narrative of accident and recovery, trauma and triumph. Something messier, something older, something true. The first person to read the new pages was her editor, a woman who had championed her work for a decade and never flinched at the hard parts. This time, she flinched. "This is a lot," her editor said, setting down the manuscript. "I mean, it's powerful, but it's not what we discussed. This goes further back. This implicates people. It's the truth." "I know, that's what worries me." Her editor leaned forward. "You've built a reputation on being unflinching, but this is different. This isn't someone else's story you're exposing. This is yours and theirs. Are you ready for what happens when this goes public?" She thought of her family. The ones who had kept the silence. The ones who had benefited from it. The ones who would see themselves named and refuse to recognize the portrait. "Ready has nothing to do with it," she said. "Truth doesn't wait for ready." Her editor looked at her for a long moment. "You know they'll say you're too much, too raw, too intense. They'll say you've gone too far." "They've been saying that my whole life." She picked up her cane and stood. "I stopped letting it stop me a long time ago." But walking home that night, the cane striking its rhythm against the pavement, she felt the old shame creeping back, the voice that had followed her since childhood. Too much, too sharp, too angry, too honest. She had spent years learning to hear that voice as a compass instead of a condemnation. But it still stung. It probably always would. She tried once to write a gentler version. It happened on a night when the pain was bad, and she'd taken too much medication and the edges of everything had gone soft and blurred. She sat at her desk and rewrote the hardest chapter. The one about the thing that had happened when she was 12, the thing no one had ever named. The thing that had lived underneath her whole life like a fault line waiting for an earthquake. She rewrote it with softer edges, implications instead of accusations, shadows instead of names. She told the truth, but she wrapped it in gauze so thick you could barely see the blood. In the morning, she read what she had written and felt sick. Not because it was bad. It was actually quite good, restrained, literary, the kind of thing that won prizes and made people nod thoughtfully instead of squirming in their seats. It was the version her family would forgive, the version that would slide down easy. It was also a lie, not in its facts, but in its impact. She had taken the knife out of the wound and replaced it with a butter knife. She had made the truth palatable, and in doing so, she had betrayed it. Her aunt's voice echoed in her memory. Truth doesn't wait for comfort. She deleted the softer version and started again. Her mother called 2 weeks before the publication date. They hadn't spoken in months, not since she'd told her mother about the memoir. Not since her mother had hung up without a word. Now her mother's voice came through the phone tight with controlled fury. "You can still stop this." "No, I can't." "You can, you just won't." A sharp breath. "Do you know what this will do to the family? To your grandmother? To me?" "I know what the silence did to me," she said quietly. "I know what it's still doing." "That's ancient history. It's over. Why do you have to drag it all up again?" "Because it's not ancient history to me, Mama. Because I've been carrying it my whole life, and I'm tired. Because you told me to be quiet, and I was quiet for 30 years, and look where it got us." The silence on the other end of the line was thick enough to choke on. "You were always too much," her mother finally said. "Even as a child. You couldn't let anything go, couldn't let anything rest." "You're right," she said. "I couldn't, and I won't." Her mother hung up. She sat holding the phone, the pain in her hip throbbing in time with her heartbeat, and felt something strange wash over her. Not grief, though there was grief in it. Not anger, though there was anger too. Freedom. For the first time in her life, she had spoken her truth to the person who had taught her to be silent. And she had not burst into flames. She had not died. She was still here, still breathing, still holding her cane with a grip that had steadied. The worst had happened, and she was still standing. Act 3. The Scar and the Speaking. The book launched on a Tuesday in October. She stood at the podium in a bookstore filled with strangers, her cane leaning against the lectern, the book open in front of her. The room was packed. People standing along the walls, sitting cross-legged in the aisles, pressed together in a way that made her skin prickle. She hadn't expected this many. She hadn't expected any of this. The reviews had been split down the middle. Half called the book brave, necessary, a masterwork of truth-telling that would change how people thought about trauma and family and silence. The other half called it self-indulgent, cruel, a betrayal of people who couldn't defend themselves. Both halves were probably right. She looked out at the crowd and felt the familiar knot in her chest. 3 years of circling had led to this moment. The truth was out. There was no taking it back, but before she could read, she had to face the villains one last time. The anger had nearly destroyed her once. In the months after she finished writing, when the book was in editing and she had nothing to do but wait, the rage had come for her. Not the clean anger of the work, the righteous heat that had fueled her art, her voice, her insistence on truth. This was something darker, something that wanted blood. She had raged at her family for their silence, at the world for making silence necessary, at herself for carrying it so long, for letting it shape her, for becoming someone who couldn't separate pain from identity. The anger had no target, and every target. It ate at her from the inside. She had almost called her publisher and pulled the book, had almost let the rage burn everything down. But her aunt had called that night as if she'd known, as if she always knew, and said, "Rage is just grief with its teeth out. Don't let it bite you. Feel it, name it, and let it pass." Standing at the podium now, she felt the last of that rage settle into something quieter. Not gone, never gone, but no longer in control. Worse than rage was what came after. The slow seep of bitterness that threatened to poison everything she touched. She had caught herself in the weeks before publication, tallying grievances, counting the years of silence, calculating what had been taken from her, what she could never get back. She had started to see her whole life as a ledger of losses, and the book as a bill finally coming due. But bitterness was just another cage. Another way of letting the past own the present. "You speak from the scar," her aunt had reminded her, "not the wound. The wound bleeds. The wound wants revenge. But the scar has healed enough to teach, are you speaking from the scar or are you still bleeding?" She had sat with that question for days, had examined her motives, her words, her heart, and she had found bitterness there. Yes, but also something else. Something that wanted not revenge, but recognition. Not punishment, but understanding. She wasn't writing to hurt them. She was writing to free herself and maybe, just maybe, to free someone else who was still trapped in the same silence she'd survived. The hardest villain was the one she'd built herself, the armor of sharpness that had protected her for so long. She had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous. That softness got you hurt. So she had made herself sharp, her tongue, her art, her edges. She had wielded truth like a blade, cutting through others' defenses while keeping her own walls impenetrable. But armor that keeps everything out also keeps everything in. The book had required her to lower the armor, to let herself be seen, not just as an artist, not just as a truth teller, but as a person who had been broken and was still being mended. It had required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like standing in a crowded room without her cane. Exposed, unsteady, terrifyingly free. Looking out at the crowd now, she made a choice. She set down her notes. She picked up her cane, not to lean on, but to hold, to let them see it. "Before I read," she said, "I want to tell you something that's not in the book." The room went still. I spent 3 years afraid to write this, not because I was afraid of what people would say. I've been called too much my whole life. I'm used to it. A small laugh rippled through the crowd. I was afraid because I didn't want to need you. I didn't want to stand here and admit that I wrote this book because I was desperate for someone to hear me, for someone to say, "I believe you. It happened. You're not crazy." She held the cane tighter. Truth doesn't wait for comfort. My aunt taught me that. But she also taught me that truth needs a witness. It needs someone on the other side listening. So thank you for being here, for listening, for being the witness I needed. She opened the book and began to read. The lines stretched around the block. She sat at the signing table, her cane propped against her chair, her hand already cramping from the inscriptions she'd written. Person after person stepped forward with her book in their hands and something unspoken in their eyes. A woman who said, "My family has the same silence. Thank you for breaking yours." A man who said nothing at all, just held her hand for a moment, tears streaming down his face. A teenager who whispered, "I'm still in it. Does it get better?" "It gets different," she told the teenager, signing their book. And different is sometimes enough. When the last person had left and the bookstore was closing, she sat alone at the table and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Quiet. Not silence. Silence was the enemy, the thing she had fought her whole life, but quiet. The kind that came after the storm passed, after the truth had been spoken, after there was nothing left to hide. Her phone buzzed. A message from her aunt. "Proud of you, mija. You spoke. Now rest." She picked up her cane and walked out into the night. The city was still awake around her. Lights and sirens and laughter and all the noise of people living their lives. She moved through it slowly, the cane tapping its familiar rhythm, her body aching but her heart steady. She had spent 3 years circling the truth, and now she had said it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The scar was still there, would always be there, but scars were just stories written on the body. And she had finally learned to read hers out loud. Her aunt's voice, one last time, settling into her like a blessing. Truth doesn't wait for comfort, but sometimes, after you tell it, comfort finds you anyway. She smiled and kept walking, the night air cool against her face, the cane steady in her hand. The silence, finally broken. This was the story of the thriller. If you are the thriller, your voice cuts through what others won't name. You speak from the scar, not the wound. Your gift is truth, and your power is the courage to tell it, even when no one is ready to hear. The silence was never yours to keep, and now it's finally broken. You've just heard the Thriller Bedtime Story, one of the 8 archetypes in the Wild Lore framework. To discover your own archetype and learn to speak your truth without apology, take the Wild Lore quiz at wildlore.co. Your story is waiting to be told.